Hello. Welcome to the League of Women Voters Forum for the Democratic and Republican candidates for Pennsylvania's 18th Congressional District, consisting of the city of Pittsburgh and many suburban areas, primarily east and south of the city. My name is Maureen Grossider, and I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh. I'll be the moderator for today's forum. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that neither supports nor opposes any candidate or political party. Our goal is to provide information to citizens so that they can actively participate in their government. This forum is one way of doing that. It is being conducted via teleconference and is being recorded and will be available for viewing on demand in its entirety on the League's Facebook page, on our YouTube channel, and also on PCTV after the event has concluded. The election for this congressional position will be held on Tuesday, November 3rd. Voters have the option of voting in person or by mail and/or absentee ballot. Specifics for how to do that and how to apply for a ballot can be found on the state's website, votespa.com. A few specifics regarding today's forum. We're going to have about 60 minutes to ask questions, and each candidate will give a closing statement. Straws were drawn earlier to determine the order in which the candidates will speak. Each candidate will have a chance to answer each question, with each person having 90 seconds to respond. There will be no time given for rebuttals. If a candidate wishes to respond to another candidate's statements, he will need to use time from the answer to the next question. I'll be asking the questions in a rotating manner so that each candidate will have the chance to be the first to answer a question. Questions have been gathered from a variety of sources, including community input, the League's Facebook page, and vote411.org, which is the League's online voters guide. Questions have been reviewed for relevance to the position being sought and also for duplication, clarity, and civility. Candidate answers will be timed, and candidates will be advised when their time has expired. Candidates should be courteous and refrain from interrupting one another. And to all of you who are watching this forum, please remember that these candidates are your friends and neighbors who've stepped forward to serve their community. And now I'd like to introduce our candidates. The candidates for today's event are Democrat Mike Doyle, who is the incumbent congressman, and Republican challenger Luke Negron. Now, for the first question, please tell us about your qualifications and relevant experience and why you're running for this office. And the question first goes to Mr. Negron.
Thank you so much for having us here. Thank you to the congressman for joining us. And yeah, since we're not doing any opening statements, I want to use a few of my seconds here to go over a few things that I think are relevant. One is that I think realistically speaking, there is one of us here who needs to and should be answering questions. There's another one of us here who has been answering questions for 30 years as a career politician. I think that we know who each of those parties are represented by. On that topic, I think that we're going to hear a lot from my opponent, from the representative, about his political experience. However, I think that's going to fall a little bit tone deaf because the working class, the middle class people who I grew up with, who I've worked with, what we know as political experience is someone who lives separate from and above the citizenry, someone who all too often sells out, and someone who can't relate to us today. I think that political experience is something that is not necessarily shined on in a positive light. The second thing that I think we're going to see a lot about is possibly attacks against the Republican Party, against Republican leadership. The problem here is that if anyone's watched interviews with me, you know that I'm a very anti-establishment Republican. I'm someone who stands against much of the corruption and elitism in both parties. I'm a military veteran. I'm a working class man. I grew up understanding the struggles of millennials, the struggles and needs of people in a modern sense and not the needs of elitists. And that is what sets me apart in this debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Mr. Doyle, same question to you.
Thank you again to League of Women Voters for holding this debate. I want to welcome Luke Negron to the debate also. Maybe a little bit of background for Luke to understand. I grew up in a blue-collar family in Swissvale. My dad was a steel worker in Braddock. My grandfather emigrated to this country and was a steel worker in Rankin. And I spent my first 2 summers when I was in college working in those steel mills. So I come from a family that was blue-collar and middle class. I've had a number of jobs growing up. I had worked in a nonprofit as an executive director of a local nonprofit in Turtle Creek. I was in the insurance business and then started my own agency. So I've been a small businessman. And it is true, I have experience in local government. When I was elected to the Borough Council when I got out of college in my early 20s, I have worked in state government for 16 years as a staff person. And I had the privilege of being elected to the United States Congress to represent Pittsburgh, which I have been doing for 13 terms now. I sit on the Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm a senior member of the Energy Subcommittee, and I'm the chairman of Communications and Technology. I have used my positions in Congress to benefit the city of Pittsburgh and this region, which I love dearly. I'm proud of my record, and if the voters choose to send me back on November 3rd, I'll continue to work hard on their behalf.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. All right, now the second question, we are going to go to Mr. Doyle first for his response. And the question is, what would be your top 3 priorities if you are reelected to the U.S. House of Representatives?
Well, first and foremost, we need to get this pandemic under control. You know, the president's most basic responsibility is to protect the American people. And this administration has failed miserably. We need a national strategy. We're at war with the virus. And when we're at war, Americans need to come together and unite behind a common strategy. What we have right now is a 50-state strategy. The president has basically told us we're on our own. One of the things I would do is, along with Joe Biden, make sure we have a national plan that gets PPE out to our frontline workers. We have a lot of people still hurting from this pandemic, and that's going to be the second piece of this. Once we get the pandemic under control, we have to rebuild the economy. We've done that initially in the spring with the CARES Act to help people who were struggling. But since that time, the Republican Party and this president feel like they don't need to do anymore. Well, I've got news for you. There's a lot of small businesses in Pittsburgh that are struggling, little mom and pop restaurants that are going to go under if we don't get them some assistance. We have put 2 proposals in front of the Republican Party and this president, and they refused to negotiate with us. The first one they said was too expensive, so we cut it $1.2 billion, or $1 trillion, I'm sorry, and they still don't want to negotiate. Meanwhile, airline industry is getting ready, already laying off employees. Businesses are hurting. People need stimulus checks. We've got a lot on our plate once we get reelected on November 3rd.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. All right, the same question to you, Mr. Negron. What would be your top 3 priorities if you are elected to the U.S. House of Representatives?
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think that first to address a little bit of a rebuttal to the representative's opening statement here. That's great that he worked in steel mills, but he admittedly has his most recent experience in the private sector in the late 80s and early 90s. I think that with the technology that is advancing as it is today, it has been said that millennials have lived the equivalent of multiple lifetimes in technology in our lifetime. That's from the 90s till the present day. Someone who has their most recent experience in the world being in the 80s is not enough. On top of that, I would say, as I predicted, we see some attacks against the Republican Party and nothing substantial against my positions. We also see that the representative, as most Democrats do, failed to address the fact that the president gave a lot of power to states. He entrusted his power in something that is very American, states' rights. He gave a lot of power to governors. And as we see, blue states actually, by and large, Gavin Newsom, Cuomo, our very own tyrant Tom Wolf, one of the friends of the representative, have the worst records and the highest deaths out of anyone in the union. This is a problem. So my priorities would be to handle COVID, but along with that goes reopening. I think that we've reached the point of diminishing returns a long, long time ago. Term limits. As someone who's against elitism on both sides of the aisle, I believe in congressional term limits. And I believe in prison and sentencing reform, which is another thing that the representative and his party have failed to do in their time of leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Okay, now question number 3, and we will start with Mr. Negron first. The pandemic has thrown in-person voting into disarray this year. At the same time, there's been an increase in legislation across the country that often makes it more difficult for people to vote, such as restrictions on mail-in voting, realignment and reduction of polling locations, and implementation of ID laws. What voting reforms do you believe are necessary to make the US election safe and secure?
Yeah, well, let's be clear about one very simple thing, right? In order to order a beer, in order to go to Kennywood, you need to show a government-issued photo ID. There is absolutely no reason that you should be allowed to vote for American leadership without first proving with a government-issued photo ID, and there are multiple forms of this that are very accessible through electronic means, through phone calls, or physically going. There's no reason you should be able to vote without first proving that you are, in fact, an American. I would also point out that a lot of these kind of 11th hour changes that we see in our voting system, specifically in Pennsylvania, come at the hands of many of Mike Doyle's friends, many of the representatives' friends, like Tom Wolf, who has bypassed the PA state legislature, who has done things that have now been ruled as unconstitutional in federal court, and who now is trying to, in the 11th hour, change voting rules. We have to ask why. If Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci have said that it is safe to vote in person, as they both have, these are bipartisan recognized medical professionals, we have to ask why the representative and his party keep pushing for mail-in votes, which very left-leaning sources like the New York Times have recognized are dangerous, are inaccurate for both parties, and do not lead to safe and fair elections. Why are you still pushing for this? And to the representative, I'd ask, why are you silent on this? And why are your friends not influenced by you to do better?
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Mr. Doyle, same question.
Our goal in this country should be to make it easy for everyone to vote. The Republicans have a sad history of voter suppression in this country that has been well documented. The president's own intelligence director has said voting by mail is safe and it's not riddled with fraud. That's just a false statement. There are, during this pandemic, some people who are more at risk than others. For them to have the option to vote by mail makes a lot of sense. It's a safe and secure way to do it, and it is not riddled with the fraud that Mr. Negron speaks about. There will be some people go to the polls. We've not stopped that. And I can tell you at the local polling places, and there's 1,300 in this congressional district, you go in there, you sign your name, they compare your signature. The people at the polling place are your neighbors from your neighborhood. They basically know you when you come in, and they check those signatures. The checks and balances are there. There's been no widespread fraud, no matter, we don't need more ways to suppress the vote and make it more difficult for people, which is what the Republicans do historically. There have been dozens, not dozens, there have been almost a dozen states that have been doing mail-in voting for decades with no fraud. Republican states, in the state of Florida, where Mr. Trump will be voting, they've been doing mail-in voting there. So if this is just a canard brought up by the Republican Party and another effort to suppress the votes and make it harder to vote instead of easier.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. All right, our next question will go to Mr. Doyle first to answer. What role should the federal government play in regulating gun use? Do you support or oppose federal and state legislation to require background checks for all gun purchases? Where do you stand on extreme risk protection orders, often known as red flag laws? Mr. Doyle.
Thank you for that question. This is a real, I think, distinction between the two candidates. I think the federal government has a responsibility to put common sense gun safety laws into practice. You know, I have watched many tragedies take place in this country where mass shootings done by people who possessed weapons that gave them the ability to shoot 30, 40, 50 bullets in a matter of minutes, causing mass casualties. These are weapons of war. They don't belong in the hands of civilians. And every time this happened, Speaker Ryan, when he was Speaker of the House, would stop to have a moment of silence. But we never did anything. When those young children were butchered in Connecticut, a lot of us thought, finally, we're going to get some gun safety laws to deal with these problems. It never happened. I helped lead a sit-in on the House floor with John Lewis in order to try to make a point that we need to have a vote. The Republicans in the House of Representatives and the Senate won't even allow a vote on the floor for gun safety laws. Now, if they want to vote against them, let them vote against them. But we should have the right to let our constituents know where we stand on these issues. I have a proud F- rating with the NRA, and I am proud of that, and I wear it as a badge of courage. And I will continue to fight for gun safety laws in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Negron, the same question.
Right. So let's circle back around to the voting really quickly. So voting by mail and absentee voting are two very different systems. Absentee voting indeed does have safeties built in. Voting by mail is something that the Democrats are trying to shove down the throat of American citizens here in the final days of an election. I think that deserves to be recognized. There is a lot of fraud. Actually, we just saw in PA that I believe 7 or 9 ballots were discarded dumped in a dumpster. They happen to be veteran ballots, which is personal to me. They also happen to be, by and large, supporting Donald Trump. And I will actually be linking on Instagram. There's a New York Times article that speaks about the dangers of mail-in voting. Of course, this is before it became convenient for the Democrats to lie about that and to mislead the people. So check out Negron for Congress on Instagram. I'll be linking that. So this is something that the people deserve to know. Something else they deserve to know is that many of the guns that have been used in these shootings are illegal firearms. This is something that the Democrats don't talk about. What does that tell you? That tells you that these guns, these illegal guns, would be in the hands of criminals anyway. I support the Second Amendment. I do not support red flag laws. This is one example of me going against my party. I know Donald Trump supports red flag laws. I simply think he's wrong on that. I oppose them. Many mass shootings are misrepresented by data. This data has actually included shootings by BB guns. So this data that the representative is talking about is fraudulent. We need to be mindful of that.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Now, question 5, Mr. Negron, it'll go to you first. Coal and fracking have played a large part in the economy of Western Pennsylvania. How would you balance support for these extractive industries versus support for newer and renewable sources of energy?
This is a pretty simple answer. I think it's that we need to continually encourage research and implementation of clean, efficient, and accessible energy of all sources. So of course, we can use solar where and when appropriate. We can use wind where and when appropriate. We can use recycling of greenhouse gases so that they aren't used once, then released into the atmosphere. Texas does this well. We use that where and when appropriate and further that technology. We need to remember, though, that all of our electricity comes from somewhere. Many environmental activists tend to push for the use of electricity and of batteries and electric cars and forget that this electricity comes from somewhere. It doesn't just magically appear out of thin air. It comes from coal plants and nuclear plants. So we need to support safe use of coal, nuclear, and natural gas. This is something that the representative and his party's nominee for president, Joe Biden, have stood against. They are both in favor of the disastrous Green New Deal, which would gut our local economy, would destroy our local union workers, would sweep the rug out from under everything that we have built here, because we lean heavily on producing parts for energy production and producing energy in Western PA. The Green New Deal is bad news for everybody. The unions know it. This is the reason that many unions have flipped to the Republican side this election cycle. Joe Biden lied about this. His campaign site does say that he supports the Green New Deal, and then he lied on the debate stage. I'd encourage the representative to address his support for the Green New Deal.
Mr. Doyle, the same question, please.
Yes, and let me start by saying in Pennsylvania, you have to request a mail-in ballot. So that's one thing that needs to be pointed out. So it is not fraud that gets talked about. The president himself said that he's for absentee ballots because you have to request that. Well, that's the process here in our state too. If you don't apply for one, you don't get a ballot. They're not mailed out automatically. With regards to the environment, I believe we can have a clean environment and good jobs. And it's a transition that's going to take place. Once again, Mr. Negron has misrepresented Joe Biden's position and mine. I did not co-sponsor the Green New Deal. And President and Vice President Biden, when here in Pittsburgh, made it very clear that he's not for banning fracking, and he certainly isn't supporting the Green New Deal. What he has said is that he would oppose new gas and oil exploration on federal lands. Well, 90% of fracking takes place on public lands or on private lands, not on public lands. So that's just the distraction that they like to use. I sit on the Energy Committee. I'm a senior member of that committee. I helped write the Clean Futures Act, which allows us to have a clean environment and good jobs. And we do it based on the science and that we get to net zero carbon by 2050 or a little bit earlier if technology allows.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Now, our next question, and we'll start with Mr. Doyle. The constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act is currently being challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court. What role, if any, do you believe the government has with respect to health care? Which policies would you support and which would you oppose?
Well, I'm a proud supporter of the Affordable Care Act. I helped write it in my committee. You know, before the Affordable Care Act, insurance companies put caps on people's annual benefits and their lifetime benefits. I met with families whose children had cancer, and their medicines were very expensive. Their treatments were expensive. And when they got to their annual cap, the insurance companies stopped paying. You'd see these families holding fish fries and fundraisers to try to be able to afford treatment for their children with cancer. The Affordable Care Act put an end to that. We said to insurance companies, you can't cap people's benefits anymore. Pre-existing conditions. Before the Affordable Care Act, one of the ways that insurance companies managed their risk was to not insure people that had certain conditions. They say, we will cover you for everything about that one thing that makes you sick. We eliminated that in the Affordable Care Act. 20 million people that didn't have insurance now in the Affordable Care Act. And what is the Republican Party doing in the middle of a pandemic? They're sitting in the Supreme Court as we speak, trying to have the Affordable Care Act declared unconstitutional and take these coverages away from people. Now they say they have a plan. Where's their plan? For 10 years, they've said they've had a plan. They have never put one forward. President Trump says he has a plan. The fact is they don't have a plan, and people who care about their health care should care about this election.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Negron, the same question to you.
Interesting. Again, here we go with more attacks against the ambiguous pie in the sky idea of the Republican Party, right? With a failure to recognize the simple fact that we live in a two-party system, which I actually don't like. I would prefer a 4 to 5 party system, and yet the representative is a Democrat. In order to run a viable campaign against him, I have to be a Republican. So again, there's no substance here, and this is something I explained from the beginning. Regarding the fact that he did not co-sponsor the Green New Deal, I never said that. Luckily, this is recorded. People can go back and play this. I said that he has spoken out in support of it, which is a fact. You can check his Twitter feed if you want to verify that. And regarding Joe Biden, actually, there's I believe, a live feed on my story on Instagram right now of Joe Biden claiming that promising he will end natural gas. So this is another lie of the Democrats, and unfortunately, the representative has participated in it. Joe Biden is on camera multiple times claiming he will end fracking in natural gas. So regarding the ACA, this was shoved down the throats of the American people. When it was passed, polls showed in a bipartisan manner that the American people did not want it. The ACA does not cover all pre-existing conditions. They like to market that. I was just talking to a mother the other day who made it very clear that in the first 6 weeks, if your pre-existing condition is not addressed, that's too bad. It's not covered. So that's another claim they make that is quite ungrounded. And then, yeah, we do need to fix American healthcare. Right now, what we have is crony capitalism with the government reaching into healthcare. I say get the government out as much as possible, endorse the free market in healthcare.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. All right, now the next question, we're going to start with Mr. Negron first. As many economists have noted, income inequality is a serious problem in this country and has been accelerated by the pandemic, putting large segments of the population into unemployment. What policies would you support or oppose to address income inequality? Mr. Negron.
Income inequality is an interesting one because in preparation for this debate, I saw an interaction between the representative and his fellow Democrat, a radical socialist named Jerry Dickinson, who actually went out on a limb and said the loss of jobs, and specifically minority jobs in district, this was a Democrat speaking, said, are not Donald Trump's fault, they are your fault, speaking to the representative. That's telling when your own Democrats say that of you in district, and when a fellow minority like myself says that and identifies you. That is very telling. The people deserve to know that and to think about that. What can we do? Number one, the free market. And this starts, I mean, this is something I wish we didn't have to say, but it starts with reopening the free market. This is something that tyrannical governors like Newsom, like Cuomo, like Wolf, like Gretchen Whitmer, as I noted, who have seen the worst results from their COVID treatment, these tyrannical governors power grabbed at the first opportunity to live out their power fantasy, and they forcefully shut down churches and small business. We see many small businesses will never reopen again. So the first thing we can do, which I wish didn't even have to be a step, is reopen the economy and then get the government as far out of the economy and let the free market drive excellence as it has always done. This is the best way to create competition. This is the best way to create upward mobility and a path forward for all citizens, not just Western PA, across the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Same question to you, Mr. Doyle.
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, we need to open our economy up when it's safe to do so. The primary responsibility of governors, because this has been thrust upon them by this president who refuses to do anything, is to keep our people safe. And that has always been first and foremost. Once that's under control, then we open the economy. In the interim, government has a role to play to make sure that we keep these people whole until this pandemic's over. And that's what we've done with the CARES Act, with the HEROES Act, and with CARES 2.0, is to make sure we're getting the resources out to small businesses, to individuals who've lost their jobs and are on unemployment, so that they can sustain themselves through this pandemic until we get it under control and then reopen the economy. The other thing I would say is we need an economy that works for everyone, not just the 1%. This president pushed through a tax cut program, 83% of which went to the very, very top. Joe Biden wants to raise taxes on anyone making over $400,000. If you make less than $400,000, we're not talking about you. Over $400,000 raised taxes, cutting corporate loopholes, cutting that corporate net income tax. It was 35%, got cut all the way down to 21, back to 25 where it was originally proposed, and put that money to help the middle class and the working class in this country who have been left behind by this administration and Republicans.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. The next question, we're going to start with you, Mr. Doyle, and the question is, in addition to accelerating income inequality issues, the pandemic has clearly demonstrated how unequal education resources are. With schools closed and the move to virtual and online education, the lack of computer and broadband access has meant poor children in under-resourced schools have fallen farther and farther behind their peers. What role, if any, do you think the federal government should play in addressing these issues, and how would you implement your suggestions? Mr. Doyle.
Well, the federal government has a huge role to play, and as chairman of Communications and Technology, I have been at the forefront of expanding access to broadband and to make it affordable. This pandemic has laid bare the fact that in many school districts, and right in my own district, we have school districts. My children went to the Woodland Hills School District. We had to hold a fundraiser there to get Chromebooks because some districts don't have the resources and the money to not only get the broadband access, but the kind of equipment that students need. We just saw recently in McKeesport on the Today Show where they got a gift of laptops for the students that they could use. So we have these disparities in the country that have been laid bare by this pandemic. We have a proposal in Congress to put $100 billion into broadband infrastructure if and when Joe Biden's president and Democrats control the House of Representatives and the Senate. We have put money for broadband deployment in the CARES Act. There was hundreds of millions of dollars that were put in the CARES Act for schools to be able to get equipment and get broadband access. So this can't be done by the private sector by itself, and this can't be done by states and local governments. It's beyond their ability to tackle this problem. We still have many areas in the country that have no access to broadband, and areas that do, they can't afford to pay for it. It's an issue that we're going to tackle big time once we can get our bill passed, which the Senate has refused to consider.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Negron, the same question to you with regard to education disparities.
Right, to circle back around to reopening the economy briefly, the representative said that we need to reopen safely. I agree. I simply think we need to trust the American people and not to impose these mandates for masks or for lockdowns. As a matter of fact, Governor Cuomo, one of the representative's friends, has come out and admitted that lockdowns didn't work. And we know that if we look at the data, the states who had the most strict lockdowns have the highest death tolls. Lockdowns did not work. The CARES and HEROES Act that he referenced are both absolutely reckless pieces of legislation, wasting the money of us and our children. And these are filled with pork, filled with things that have nothing to do with COVID-19 relief and have everything to do with trying to sneak in partisan policy. So I think that that's shameful. Look, regarding education, I'm a big supporter of school choice, specifically for people like myself, for working class, for lower income, and for minorities. School choice is something that would give your money back to you, give your money back to you and your family to choose how best to spend your tax dollars rather than being forced to spend your money through property taxes on failing schools. And if you look at, and this isn't me saying it, look at national ratings. Our public schools are atrocious. Europe has done far better from us. We would do very well to learn from some of their attitude of giving children K through 6 shorter workdays with more hands-on training, and implementing school choice, giving people the ability to choose how best to educate their family and prepare for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Now, the next question, Mr. Negron, will go to you first. During this year's primary season, we heard a great deal about climate change concerns, particularly from younger voters. In light of a summer with more extensive wildfires than ever before, stronger and more damaging hurricanes, drought conditions, and extensive flooding during the spring, what specific policies, if any, would you support to address these issues?
Yeah, so there are a few somewhat nuanced claims and arguments worked into that question there that I'd like to address. Number one is the wildfires, which Gavin Newsom, governor of California, came out and claimed were the result of climate change. This is a lie. This has been proved to have been arson. We know this. And yet the lie persists. Why? Because it is politically convenient. I think that's disgusting. Now, make no mistake, climate change is happening. Actually, if you remember back several decades, you'll see that people on the left were claiming that there was going to be global cooling. And now they went to global warming, and then they went to climate change, because climate change is a more ambiguous term that can cover no matter what, they're right? If it gets cooler or it gets hotter, either way, they were correct. Climate change is happening. If we look at estimates via NASA, which are linked on my website, we see that climate change has happened throughout Earth's history. The Earth, with relative frequency and reliability, heats and cools in a wave curve pattern. We are in a heating pattern right now. The only question is how much of this has been contributed to us after the industrialization of the world. And there certainly has been some contribution by us. And like I said, I support common sense environmental policy, but not this politicized pseudoscience that we see on the left side of the aisle, which my opponent has largely supported. I think that's a mistake. And I would also go further to say that any climate regulations we impose on Americans, we also need to impose on our trade allies so that they aren't abusing the same world. We aren't paying them.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. All right, Congressman Doyle, the same question to you.
My opponent sounds like so many of the climate science deniers that we hear in the United States Congress and the Republican Party. The fact is the overwhelming evidence of climate scientists are telling us that the Earth is heating up. And if we continue on this path, that we are dooming our grandchildren and the future of not only our country, but the planet. I am one of the authors of the Clean Futures Act. This is a piece of legislation which follows the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to get us to net zero carbon by 2050, which is what the climate scientists tell us we must do if we want to reduce the most harmful effects of global warming on this planet. And I'm committed to do that. I believe that technology will allow us to do that even sooner. I have passed legislation, energy storage bill, which allows us to store solar and wind renewable energy to make it more like base capacity. One of the problems with renewables is the intermittency of it. Technology can help us do that. I support advanced nuclear batteries that can help us turn the lights on when the wind and the sun aren't running, and when they are running, allow that to happen. There's a lot of things we can do, and we can do this by creating new jobs too in this economy. So I'm totally committed to making sure we are net zero carbon by 2050. That's what the scientists tell us we need.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. All right, the next question, we're going to start with you, Mr. Doyle. The COVID-19 pandemic has cost more than 214,000 Americans their lives, infected 7 million of us, cost millions their jobs, increased food insecurity, and increased the educational divide. Given that many scientists believe we will continue to see pandemics like this in the future, do you believe that we should have national or state-by-state responses to such events? What would you envision a national response encompassing? Quarantines, isolation, contact tracing, shutdowns, whatever. Mr. Doyle.
Well, this administration, this president has failed miserably in the conduct of dealing with this pandemic. And it's exactly because we don't have a national strategy. The president basically said to the governors, you're on your own. Make up your own plans. The president made fun of people who wear a mask, and he himself wouldn't wear a mask. You could almost tell on the House of Representatives floor who the Democrats and Republicans are by who was wearing a mask and who wasn't. When this type of leadership at the very top of our country is sending a message out to the rest of the Americans that this isn't something you have to worry about. It's going to go away magically. It'll just disappear. You shouldn't fear it. This is why we are where we are today. With over 200,000 of our citizens dead, the United States, the #1 in cases, #1 in deaths as a percentage of our population, the worst in the world because we had no plan. We need a national strategy. We need everybody on the same page. We need everybody exhibiting the same kind of mitigation policies that the medical experts and the scientists tell us we have to do to get this virus under control until we get a safe and effective vaccine. That's what we need to do.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Negron, future pandemics.
Regarding the climate briefly, the representative made a claim that is unfounded. This claim comes from the idea that 95% of scientists have endorsed climate change as a world-ending threat. That claim has been debunked multiple times. It's a false claim, and he called me a climate change denier It's interesting that in the answer 30 seconds prior, I had confirmed that climate change is happening. I had simply contextualized it within science. Again, I'm glad that this is recorded so people can go back and see this type of hypocrisy and misrepresentation for themselves. So regarding mask mandates, quarantine mandates, and extremely intrusive contact tracing, which for those who don't know is supported by Nancy Pelosi. She wants to follow you electronically in many cases through apps on your phones and through other means, know who you're interacting with, and have that sent to the government. I absolutely do not support that. Now, look, I'm not scared of COVID-19, and neither is the representative. I can tell you what's in my heart. I'm not scared of it. I can tell you he's not scared of it because at the height of the COVID pandemic, he marched in public protest with people screaming and spitting all over the place with no social distancing and very few people wearing masks. So neither of us is scared of this. But let's be clear, for people over 65, it is very deadly. For people under 65, the data actually shows us that the seasonal flu is more dangerous. So I absolutely support taking care of the demographics who are targeted by this, but I actually support following the science, and I support valuing freedom over fear, which is what kind of seems to be the Democratic way.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Now, the next question, Mr. Negron, we're going to go to you first. Many voters believe that our federal government at all levels, but particularly in Congress, has become more and more partisan. How would you personally go about finding consensus and reducing gridlock? Which changes to election laws, such as campaign finance reform, or term limits would you support?
All of the above. I mean, this is an easy one, right? I could literally just say all of the above and end it there. But this is something that I'd be interested to hear my opponent's take on because he's benefited from these outdated and insufficient laws. Let's go to the campaign finance laws, right? They allow, in most cases, they allow campaign style mailers to be sent by incumbents using taxpayer dollars. They allow an incumbent to raise money over the period of, in my opponent's case, almost 3 decades. And then any challenger has to try and compete with that with several months of raising funds. I think that those laws need to be changed. As a big supporter, I believe I mentioned it earlier, of term limits, I absolutely believe that they are necessary and in a bipartisan manner. Look, we've got sellout elitist Republicans and we've got sellout elitist Democrats. And I think that they are both a problem. These career politicians, which unfortunately are represented by the man across the screen from me, they are a problem. They have been in seats using their position of power to defend their position of power for years, in many cases doing nothing. My opponent, I believe, has passed 15 pages of legislation in 26 years. He has never been the lead sponsor on a bill in 26 years, almost 3 decades. This is stuff that we see on both sides of the aisle as a problem. I believe it leads to a lot of gridlock, a lot of kind of this good old boys club, old rich white men in power. This is something that many people in my generation have risen up against. That's why term limits, if you look at national polls, are supported by Republicans and Democrats alike. I think that is absolutely the path forward.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Mr. Doyle, the same question. How would you find consensus and reduce gridlock?
Yeah, so I think the question is how do we stop the gridlock? And I would say one of the things that I would like to see happen is reform in the redistricting process. What we have are a lot of districts that have been gerrymandered by state legislatures. That's how it's done here in Pennsylvania and a lot of other states, although some have put reforms in, which is resulting in a lot more solid red, solid blue kinds of districts as opposed to swing districts. So the power and the pull in those districts comes from the people at the extremes, unfortunately, whether it's extreme left or extreme right. So I think redistricting reform would be an important step. As far as the term limit goes, we have a term limit. It's 2 years. I have this job for 2 years. And every 2 years, 700,000 plus people that live in this congressional district and say, Mr. Doyle, you're not going to represent us anymore. Somebody else is going to do that. I was in a 7-way Democratic primary back in 1994 when I first ran. And I went through some of the same rigors that my opponent's talking about when you're running for the first time. But, you know, we have a system that allows every 2 years for us to go in front of our voters and state our case and tell them why they should either send us back or send us home. And I support that system, and we're going through that right now. I've had a primary opponent. I've got a general election opponent. People in this district can make a decision, and I trust their judgment.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Now, the next question, Mr. Doyle, we're going to start with you first. Reproductive rights for women is an issue of grave concern to voters. Where do you stand on this issue? And which policies, particularly a woman's right to choose, do you support and which do you oppose?
This is an issue that I think every American struggles with, and I've seen this personally amongst friends and associates. I represent over 700,000 people in the city of Pittsburgh and suburbs around it. They're people of all faiths. I represent Christians, I represent Jews, I represent Muslims, I represent Hindus, I represent atheists. I don't think that it's proper for the federal government to impose any one religious belief on the population. This is a very personal matter between a woman and her doctor and her family. And I know people that have gone through this, and it's a very painful process. I don't know anyone that wants to have an abortion. People were put in very difficult situations, and I think that this is a choice that should be left to the woman, her doctor, her family, and each person's personal belief on how they would do this personally, but not for the government or anyone else. We left England because they had a state religion. We don't have a state religion in the United States. People can practice freely any religion they want or no religion at all. And I don't think it's right for the federal government to impose a standard on a woman based on some people's religious belief, even if I might personally happen to believe that way. And that's why I support a woman's right to choose.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Negron, the same question to you.
Yeah, regarding the brief comment that my opponent made about elections, of course he likes the current system because it favors him. The fact is that since the founding of our country, elections have changed. We didn't need term limits at the founding of our country because many of the things I listed off, like the FEC standards, were not imposed back then. The FEC, as we both know, was founded in, I believe, the 1970s. And so of course, these advantages that have come to incumbency are something that he would not want to change because they threaten his position of power. Regarding abortion, look, I'm a Christian. My opponent is an outspoken Catholic. I think there are questions to be raised, though. As a Catholic, why do you disagree with one of the main tenets of the Catholic Church, which is openly pro-life? You are pro-abortion. So why is that? I think that's something that we need to ask. Secondly, just because something is legal does not mean that it is right. We saw this with slavery. Slavery was legal. That does not mean that it was morally just. You talked a lot about mandating religion. This is a misunderstanding. I'm shocked that a senior member of almost 3 decades in Congress has. Number one, the separation of church and state is nowhere in our Constitution. It's actually in a private letter, I believe, from Thomas Jefferson. Number two, separation of church and state means no government mandated religion. It does not mean that we keep morality out of politics. Again, I'll come back to the topic of slavery. Slavery was a moral choice that Americans rose up in a unified fashion against. Where would we be today if we said, hey, we can't have moral choices against slavery? So I am pro-life and I will never apologize for that.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Now, the next question, we're going to go to you, Mr. Negron, first. Criminal justice is a serious issue of concern among all citizens. Many systems in our country, particularly the cash bail system, negatively affect poor people, particularly people of color. What type of criminal justice reform issues would you advocate for in Congress?
I've been an outspoken advocate for ending the private prison system, and this is simple. It's because I think it opens the door to corruption. Anytime that you incentivize a private industry to make their money by incarcerating their fellow citizens, I'm not implying that every private prison must be corrupt, but it opens the door to corruption, and I think that we need to stand against that. I'm also a big fan of prison and sentencing reform, specifically for nonviolent drug abusers who are better sent to reform school as opposed to prison, where we see them falling into this really sick cycle of becoming viewed by their peers as a criminal, being negatively influenced by the prison, and then going back to prison ultimately, and us losing a productive member of society. Those are things that I'm for. Now, my opponent, on the other hand, has only a 53% rating with the ACLU, a 0 rating with normal, which is a formation for drug reform, a 40% rating with CURE for sentencing reform, These are, look, I'm several years out of college, but 0, 53, and 40 are not passing grades. This means that at best, he has been flip-flopping throughout his nearly 3 decades as a representative on the topic of race and specifically criminal sentencing reform and prison reform. So I think that this is something we need to acknowledge as a problem. This is perhaps somewhat of a holdover of the institutionalized racism, which we had back during slavery. And this is something I stand against. And this is, by the way, a very bipartisan issue, which I think it's sad to say Mike Doyle has failed on.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Mr. Doyle, criminal justice reform.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to do in this area. And I certainly don't support private prisons either. And I do think I have always been an opponent of mandatory sentencing. I think judges need to have discretion in these kinds of cases. That I supported the reform, the Justice and Policing Act, which does several things. It bans no-knock warrants and chokeholds. It creates a national registry that when we have a bad police officer, that he can't go to another jurisdiction and get a job. Look, the overwhelming amount of men and women who serve us in law enforcement are good, decent people who have a very tough job and work very hard for us. But we have cases where that's not the case, and we see it disproportionately, unfortunately, in the African-American community. So there needs to be some reforms. Body cameras on police officers, we think, is important also. We can put these reforms in which actually protect the police and the public, and this is important. But we have to be sensitive to the fact that there has been institutional racism in this country for a long time. When you think about cash bail, all that does is let the wealthy make their bail and they go back home awaiting their trial, while the poor, mostly minorities, have to sit in prison. That needs to be reformed too. There's a lot of reforms we can make. I have been at the forefront of helping to make those reforms.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Now, the next question, Mr. Doyle, we're going to start with you first. Let's move on to some trade policies. President Trump levied significant tariffs on goods coming from China. It has had negative effects on farmers, manufacturing, and other industries. Where do you stand on these tariffs, and what kind of trade policy do you believe the United States should be pursuing with nations like China?
Well, I can tell you that I have been a member of the Congressional Steel Caucus my entire service in Congress. And I have testified multiple times in front of the International Trade Commission on dumping that takes place not only in China, but Korea, Brazil, where products are being dumped in our country below the cost of production and have cost many steel jobs in Western Pennsylvania. So I've been a strong proponent of making sure that we have laws that guarantee a level playing field for manufacturing in this country. It's a mixed bag with the tariffs. The farmers have been hurt badly by these tariffs, and the president has been trying to send aid to them to make up for the fact that his policies have hurt them badly. But we do have some instances in this country where people aren't playing by the rules. And my biggest beef with our laws today is you can't file an action in front of the International Trade Commission until you've been damaged. So it's not enough to just know that someone's cheating on the laws. You have to be damaged before you can go to court to get relief. I think that's a terrible law, and I've been fighting for years to try to get that changed. If we don't have a level playing field for our country, we can compete with anyone. This isn't about competition. Give us a level playing field. Americans will always do well. I have fought for fair trade laws my entire career in Congress. I will continue to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Negron, the same question to you regarding trade policy.
Yeah, look, I agree that we need a level playing field. I think that looks like supporting free market principles, though. I believe that means freeing up the competition within free markets in the United States to thrive. Now, I do support, when we're talking about international trade, I do support the trade war that the president has engaged with China. Why? Because China has been in a trade war, a one-sided trade war against us for years. And we saw a failure in the Obama presidency, a failure in the Bush presidency to address this trade war. We just let them keep getting away with it. Now, As a military man, as someone who's studied national security and, professionally, this is something I can tell you has a very simple cause. It's because of mutually assured destruction through nuclear powers, through us and China. And it's because traditional warfare is not going to happen right now, because we know that anyone who loses a traditional war is going to fall back on their nukes. And none of us is that crazy. None of us wants to die in nuclear winter. So what do we do to bypass that? We have trade war, right? We have war through soft power, through political power. This is something Donald Trump understands that he's engaged in with China, and that he was winning at prior to the COVID pandemic, prior to these shutdowns, which also, surprise, surprise, are because of a gift from China. Now, regarding some economic policy here, in his 30 years in power, near 30 years in power, the representative allowed tungsten from China to be used in military service weapons. That's one example of a failure over years.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Now, we're going to start the next question with you, Mr. Negron. And we're going to infrastructure here. Many citizens believe our roads, our bridges, dams, airports, water and sewer systems, in addition to transportation infrastructure, need major overhaul. Should the burden of doing this fall primarily on local and state governments? What role, if any, should the federal government play in this?
Yeah, I believe that this is primarily, as it is structured right now, this is a state level issue. And I believe it's a shame here that we see that the Democrat-run city of Pittsburgh has really become actually something of a national joke when it comes to infrastructure. If you look up Pittsburgh potholes, you'll see a lot of memes making fun of Pittsburgh. It's a shame that our Democrat leadership has allowed that. Representative Doyle's friend, Peduto, has allowed this to happen, as has his Democrat governor, Tom Wolf. So I believe that this is a shame. However, it is generally structured as a state's issue. We do have a state commission for infrastructure. We have appointees under the governor for infrastructure. I would support working with them. I would also support leveraging something that my opponent really hasn't leveraged very much, which is simply your influence as an elected official, using your influence for the people, for the voters, but also for your friends in politics to bring these needs to the foreground. This is something that I can't be too hard on my opponent here, because many elected officials haven't used their influence effectively. We see young people like AOC, though I disagree with her on just about everything, she uses her social influence as an elected official to a very powerful extent in bringing about the change that she thinks is right. Now, I think she's wrong, but that doesn't change the fact that she's effective. I think that we need leaders who are going to do that, even though this is, by and large, legally speaking, and should continue to be a state level issue.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Mr. Doyle, the same question on infrastructure.
Yeah, my opponent really doesn't understand how this works. It is beyond state government to fix the crumbling infrastructure that we see in this country. You know, during the Eisenhower administration, when the national highway system was implemented, as states were trying to build highways, you get to the state border and the next state didn't have the money or didn't start their project, and the road would end there. When we're talking about rebuilding our infrastructure, and Joe Biden, when he's president, is going to make this one of his top priorities. This is money that the federal government passes through. A lot of what the states use as we speak today with their construction project is pass-through funds from the federal government. So this is chiefly a federal responsibility. It doesn't get any cheaper not to do it. We have had a gas tax in effect since 1993, has never been raised, not even 1 penny, federal gas tax. It funds the Highway Trust Fund. Every year people want to do an infrastructure project. Nobody wants to pay for it. Well, I got news for you. It doesn't get any cheaper the longer we don't do it. And this isn't Democrat or Republican infrastructure. This is U.S. infrastructure. This is how we put our people back to work. This is how we get our suppliers back to work. We need to do a huge infrastructure bill, not just roads and bridges, but broadband, the grid, the entire lot. This will be a primary focus of the next administration under Joe Biden.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Now, the next question will go to you, Mr. Doyle, first. Our national debt has risen dramatically and now exceeds $27 trillion. This is the largest it has been since the end of World War II. How would you propose to address this issue in the next Congress? What kinds of cuts would you support? And what kinds of revenue enhancing initiatives would you also support?
Well, first of all, this is not a time that we're in right now as we speak to be cutting certain things. We're in a pandemic. Interest rates are actually minus. Right now, we're able to borrow money basically without paying interest on it. And the country right now needs to get back on its feet once we get this virus under control. So once we have a vaccine and once it's widely distributed and once we have this pandemic under control, we need to rebuild our country. The private sector and local governments don't have the money to do that. I think we need to continue to invest that money in our infrastructure and in building back our economy better. So that needs to be done right away. This is not the time to talk about those kinds of cuts. How do we fund some of that? The top 1% in this country has done very well this last decade, especially with the tax cuts given to them. I would like to see that top bracket restored to where it was before the Trump tax cuts. Corporations had their taxes slashed 14%. I think we can do a little bit better to give some of that back. And we need a tax policy that doesn't allow a billionaire to pay $750 in federal income tax. I don't think the average American quite understands how that's possible under these laws. But in the tax Trump plan, we see that that has benefited the very, very wealthy in this country, and that needs to be changed.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Negron, the national debt.
Yeah, first, I want to congratulate the representative on some nice little verbal sleight of hand there. Notice we were talking about local infrastructure, and he started mentioning hitting me on national highways back from several decades ago as an example. We're talking about local infrastructure here, local roads. Of course, national highways were and are a national issue, but I believe that that deserves to be addressed. Now, in almost 3 decades in power, the representative has failed to balance the budget, as have his fellow career politicians and elitists on both the Republican and Democratic side. I believe that that is inexcusable. What happens to a private citizen when they fail to balance their own budget in their yearly tax filings? Will they get fined or they go to jail? What happens to Congress if they fail to balance the national budget, fail to do their job handling the purse? They continue on, business as usual, using our taxpayer dollars. As a senior representative, I really would challenge you as to why you haven't at least spoken out about that more. Because I understand one rep can't do it all, but why not at least bring this bang the drum, bring it to the forefront? We haven't seen this. Now, lastly, he addressed some tax loopholes. This is a bit of an awkward scenario for him to be in, because the tax loopholes that they are alleging Donald Trump took advantage of are created by who? The legislature. The legislature is who? Oh, that's the man sitting across the screen from me. That's the man who wrote those tax loopholes or allowed them to exist. So who's to blame, the businessman or the person who made the rules?
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Now, next, we're going to go to Mr. Negron first for a response. President Trump recently commented that he might reduce refugee immigration to 15,000 people a year, which would be the lowest it has been in decades. Where do you stand on the issue of immigration? Describe the types of immigration policies that you support and oppose.
Yeah, I think that we need to first define our terms here. What I suspect my opponent might do, which the Democrats often do, is they mix, again, with a little verbal sleight of hand, immigrants, which I am a proud member of an immigrant family. I'm only a second-generation American, meaning all 4 of my grandparents immigrated here. They mix immigrants with illegal immigrants. They say Donald Trump is anti-immigrant. No, he's not anti-immigrant. Republicans aren't anti-immigrant. We are anti-illegal immigration. There's a stark difference there, and it's very offensive to the legal immigrants who worked hard to get here to imply that they are one and the same. That said, I have close people to me who are trying to immigrate here legally, and I think that our immigration system needs to be streamlined. It takes far too long for our great legal, lawful immigrants to come here legally, in some cases 10 to 20 years. This system works off of an antiquated lottery system in many cases for people to get their right to become an American citizen. That's unacceptable in the modern age. Regarding slowing immigration for all legal purposes right now, in the midst of a global pandemic, I think that that is possibly wise. because we don't want to bring in more possibly infected people who we don't know where they've come from and what they've been in contact with while we're trying to sort this out at home. But by and large, of course, I support legal immigration. It's what America was built on. It's what my family was built on. I wouldn't be here without it. I think we need to streamline the process, and I stand against illegal immigrants who abuse our system.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Mr. Doyle, same question regarding immigration.
Thank you. First, I'd like to let Mr. Negron know that the last time that our country ran a surplus, for a couple of years, by the way, was during the Clinton administration. And we almost came close to paying off the national debt during the Clinton administration, an administration that took place while I was in Congress. But when the Republicans took over, we saw that deficit go right back up. And under Donald Trump, it's gone up higher than it's ever gone up in our history. So that's just a little bit of correction for him. We need a compassionate immigration policy. Like Mr. Negron, my grandparents came over to this country from Ireland and from Italy. And this is why our country's great. Our diversity is our strength. Right now, we have a lot of young people who come over here as babies. They didn't even know they were being brought over here. We call them dreamers, that have served in our military, who are working, who are good citizens, people without records that are trying to live the American dream that we've all had the blessing to live. And yet we still can't get a solution for these people who, through no fault of their own, were brought into this country by their parents. I don't believe in separating families either. I would like to see a path for citizenship for these dreamers and their families. If people abide by the law, have a job, pay their taxes,
Thank you.
They have a right to stay in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Okay, now this is going to be our last question, and we're going to start with you first, Mr. Doyle. During this century, the United States has been involved in 2 lengthy and difficult wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they've largely been fought by a volunteer army, often composed of people who are economically disadvantaged. That's meant that many voters ignored the consequences of those conflicts. In fact, President Trump has called some service members suckers and losers. Where do you stand on the issue of some form of national service for all citizens? Would you support or oppose it?
I actually think that's a great idea. I also think it's disgraceful for a president who, when it was his turn to serve, found a way out of it and didn't serve. Someone who called John McCain, who was a hero, somebody that he likes his heroes not to be caught. Some of these statements are just unbelievable. My dad was a 100% service-connected disabled veteran. He fought in World War II in France and Germany. Died at 61 years old as complications from his service. Left my mother with 4 children. So my brother and I have a brother and 2 sisters. My brother got a job when he got his doctorate degree at Pitt at the Veterans Administration. He's worked there for the past 30-some years, helping our veterans. My first committee assignment was on the Veterans Affairs Committee because I wanted to make sure that we were helping those people who have given service. I think it's a great idea for everyone after high school to take a year of public service. I think it'd be a growing experience for them. It would teach them the value and seeing the world and as it is and widen their perspectives. And I think it would make them better when they go back, whether it's to college or a trade school or whatever their chosen profession is. Everybody should have to give some service back to this country that's given so much to all of us. So I think public service is a great idea.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Negron, the same question to you.
Yeah, I think we need to circle back around quickly. The representative referenced the Clinton administration several administrations ago, decades and decades ago, and failed to recognize that he had 8 years of Barack Obama to balance the budget. So did that just not exist? Did that not happen? And by the way, 8 years of Joe Biden, who's now asking for 4 more years. So I think that is noteworthy. Regarding separating families, I actually largely agree, but you know who doesn't agree? Barack Obama, who actually built the cages and started family separation at the border. Family separation, which, by the way, Donald Trump ended. Speaking of Donald Trump, we need to first recognize, in reference to your question, Maureen, that Donald Trump is the only president in recent history who has not gotten us into another new war. Bush did, and Barack Obama did. And I believe that that is something often overlooked. We also need to recognize that he's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for 2 peace deals, historic in the Middle East. And he was recognized by the leader of South Korea as being instrumental in negotiating Korean peace. I don't hear this mentioned very often. And Marina, I don't want to have too much of a Chris Wallace moment here debating the moderator, but I have to push back. You said that it's fact that Donald Trump has called service members suckers and losers. As a service member, I can tell you that's simply not true. John Bolton, who was actually there, who was no friend to Donald Trump, has said that that was not true. This is a media lie based on an anonymous source, and people who are confirmed to have been there have said that this is in fact a falsehood.
Thank you, Mr. Negron. Now we're going to go to closing statements. And because Mr. Negron went first, we're going to have Mr. Doyle go first here with our closing statement. Mr. Doyle.
First of all, I want to thank the League of Women Voters for doing this. This is a great organization, a nonpartisan organization that's just dedicated to making sure people have information about their candidates. I want to thank Luke Negron for participating in the debate. I think it is a responsibility of all of us as candidates to put ourselves in front of the voters and answer these questions, and I'm happy to do so. I am a proud progressive Democrat who believes that we need a national strategy to defeat this pandemic. I believe that we shouldn't be trying to take away people's health care in the middle of a pandemic with the court case on the ACA. I believe that we need a vibrant infrastructure program. We need to build this economy back better, but we can't do that until we get this virus under control. That's job one. We need to listen to our scientists and our medical experts. They're the ones that can give us the protocols and tell us when it's safe to reopen this economy. And when it is, I think we need to do it in a big way. We can have a clean environment and create good jobs. They're not mutually exclusive. We can do both. And I intend to do that. And yes, I believe we need tougher gun laws and common sense gun safety. There's no reason why people shouldn't go through background checks. And I see no purpose to have military weapons in the hands of civilians. I also think it's important we elect Joe Biden president. And I encourage everybody to get out and vote on November 3rd. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Negron, your closing statement, please.
Regarding that closing statement, a few brief notes. Number one is that we already have background laws. The representative knows this. I know this. We have background check laws. And he also referenced earlier shooting 50, 40, or 60 rounds in several minutes. You can do that with a bolt action rifle. This just reflects the fact that the representative and many people in power want to make laws about something being guns that they know nothing about. Speaking on that topic, I think we have 2 different experiences to compare here. We have the experience of a military working class citizen who grew up with you, has experienced academia, has experienced student loan debt, and we have the experience of a career elitist and a career politician. I believe that mine enables me better to speak to the needs today. And as a matter of fact, that's a bipartisan agreed upon topic. His former opponent, a radical socialist, Jerry Dickinson, pointed to the representative and said, he's been here too long and his leadership has failed. And if a freedom-loving individual like myself and a radical socialist are pointing in the same direction and saying that's a threat, I think the people should listen. So look, I mean, if you want a status quo elitist, if you want a Washington insider, if you want more of the same, then by all means support Representative Doyle. But if you want someone who neither party in power, who Washington, D.C. Will not know what to do with, if you want an outsider, if you want someone who understands modern struggles, then please vote for me. You can check out negron2020.com for more information. I thank everyone for being here. Thank the representative for his time for doing this. Thank you, Maureen.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh, I would like to thank our candidates, Mr. Doyle, Mr. Negron, for participating in this forum. It's one of the most important ways that voters in your district, the 18th Congressional District of Pennsylvania, can learn about your positions on the issues important to them. I'd also remind voters who are watching that you can obtain information about all the races on your ballot in your area by going to vote411.org. and entering your street address, and the ballots for your specific area will appear. Please remember that Election Day is November 3rd. Remember that the last day to register is October 19th, and the last day to apply for a mail-in or absentee ballot is October 27th. Mail-in and absentee ballots must be mailed by November 3rd and received by the Allegheny County Election Department no later than November 6th. Information on over-the-counter voting and drop-off sites for mail-in ballots can be found on the Allegheny County election website, alleghenyvotes.com. This forum is the property of the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh and can be found in its entirety on the League's Facebook page and our YouTube channel. Thank you for your attention.